Welcome to the American Intelligence Media. My name is Douglas Gabriel. I'll be your host today, and we are so excited. I can't tell you how excited Betsy is particularly, because we have with us today Michael McKibben. And as you've already seen, we put out a few audios, but we're going to do a video because this is an historic moment. The reason we're so excited is because his story is a story that is probably the most profound story that has been happening for the last 17 years, but we also get to see it playing out right now in current affairs. So we're going to go into that, but at first I need to apologize. As you probably all know, I usually don't use notes, but this case is so incredibly technical that I must read to you an introduction as a framework, and then we'll begin our conversation with Michael. But first, let me just set the scene here, because this story is big, and you might really have to open your mind to take this in, and this is the reason we're going to do a series of these videos with Michael McKibben, who is the owner and, of course, the person who invented what we call social networking with his company, Leader Technology. So let me read this, and if you don't mind. One of the largest government-sponsored industrial espionage thefts of copyrights, trade secrets, and patents in modern time was the theft of scalable social networking inventions. The technology and programming code that underlie Facebook, Gmail, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and most of the other large-scale social networking companies runs on Leader Technology's intellectual property. They were stolen by a group of criminal lawyers, judges, spies, and bankers working with complete impunity and in total disregard for the law. Under the guise of IBM Eclipse Foundation, James Chandler III, who was also a national security advisor and top White House attorney, led this group of criminals who, interestingly enough, are also appearing in the news currently due to their most recent discovered crimes. People you know: John Podesta, Robert Mueller, Rod Rosenstein, John Breyer, James Breyer, Larry Summers, Uri Milner, Alisher Asmanoff, Mark Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg, Bill and Hillary Clinton, and a host of others who are not so well known and in the shadows. They are the same criminals, just different crimes. Usually, we see them stealing oil, gold, uranium, wherever they can, and any other resources. But this time, they stole the very software code that is utilized by the largest tech companies in America, Europe, Russia, China, South America, and anywhere else they can market it. They make trillions off of this theft. They carved up the globe and all the markets in each region, and each criminal got a piece of the pie using Leader Technology's stolen trade secrets. Eric Schmidt took America and Europe. Chandler got South America. Summers and his sidekick Sheryl Sandberg joined Schmidt in taking America. Uri Milner, Alisher Usmanov, and Summers got Russia, and the Breyers got China. And a host of fake tech lords became the frontmen for all the various social networks we see cropping up everywhere. The richest companies in the world: Google, Facebook, Amazon, et al. The criminals got filthy rich off of stealing Michael McKibben's and Leader Technology's inventions. What did Leader Technology get? 17 years of lies, deceit, legal maneuvering, patent tricks, industrial espionage, betrayal, governmental manipulation, court fraud, and $10 million in legal bills, as well as 7 separate lawsuits brought against Leader Technology itself to try to bankrupt them. What does Leader want? A rectification of the situation that can be a win-win situation for everyone involved, including U.S. taxpayers, the government, the former tech lords themselves, who knowingly stole the trade secrets, and most especially Leader Technology's long-suffering shareholders. Michael McKibben is the founder and chief inventor of Leader Technologies and the person responsible for the biggest explosion of internet technology in history. So you can imagine, after hearing that, how thrilled we are that Michael is here really for the first time to give a complete expose on how this happened and what we can do to make this into a win situation. So Michael, welcome to the American Intelligence Media. We are so thrilled that you've joined us and you're willing to have this conversation with us. Let me after the framing, let me just ask a question. Michael, can you tell us what it was like to discover the most powerful invention of the digital age? Had you ever done anything like this before, and did you do it by yourself, or did you have help?
That's a big question. I have invented things before. I have created a lot of different products. In the pre-computer days, a planning system, we talked about some of the consultants that did management consulting. I did management consulting, started in developing software back in the early 80s with the early sales manager programs, and then began looking at the market as computers were beginning to become more commercial, especially personal computers, and developed a number of different products, like we called one Scorekeeper, which was an early executive information management system. And it was during that time that we met folks from AT&T. They were running into a problem, and by the 93, 94 timeframe, actually secured the contract as a private contractor to rebuild AT&T's email system. So by the mid-90s, we were on the map, having rebuilt AT&T's system, email system that was actually shipped with Windows 95. So done a lot of work in management consulting, leadership development, organizational development, and then morphed all that knowledge and experience into developing software. So yeah, I've done a lot of work prior to this invention. And it was during the time with the AT&T project that I really began seeing the big problem, the collaboration problem that was stymieing most of the technology world in how to make their collaboration products scalable.
And then, so did you do this on your own? Did you have a group of other engineers with you?
Well, with the earlier products, it was small groups. I mean, most people think that if you're going to build a big product, you've got to have lots of programmers, and that's not true. I think most of the most significant developments in software have occurred with probably a team of less than 12 people. Because you get too many people in a room, it's like anything else, too many cooks spoil the broth. And so generally my teams were small teams, people I hired, and we just focused on what we wanted to do. So there were other people involved, but in the cases that I just mentioned, I was the leader of the team.
And they had a lot of experience, I think you've told me. What were their backgrounds, some of these other engineers?
Well, the technology group that I put together to build what we now know as social networking was a little bit different project, because by the time I had stopped the AT&T project, I recognized that the problem of collaboration as the internet was emerging was a very different technical and engineering problem. And it was so intense that I recognized that the market that was primarily led back then by IBM and Microsoft and Group Novell and groups like that were not seeing the problem properly. And we had seen that from me supporting most of AT&T's primary customers around the planet. And so I actually put together, designed a team of people with expertise in telecommunications, in databases, in operating systems, in network systems. And we actually came together very specially designed as a group, with me directing the traffic, as it were. And we basically recognized that we needed to figure out what was wrong with collaboration in a large-scale environment. And it took that group of people 2.5 to 3 years to figure out what the problem was. So it was a very complex problem. So that was a lot different kind of program, but yeah, there were other people involved too.
So you had plenty of experience in this area before, during, and after, when we are told that Mark Zuckerberg, in a week developed this during finals week at Harvard, by the way, and that when you were working on this, he was still in high school. So it's kind of hard to understand how your Leader Technology lawsuit against Facebook hasn't won the day. But let's go back a little bit and ask this question. Exactly what is the specific nature of what you and your team invented, and what was new about it compared to the chat rooms and the legacy groupware that was already being used, which you mentioned a little bit here. But what was the real step that you took that really was something that could have received a patent, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But what is that big step that you and your team took?
Well, at the time, the messaging environment, the communications environment, the way people were using email had a certain approach to it, and there was an element of it related to what's called groupware, which is a way for groups of people to exchange files, update files in a large-scale environment. And that was okay for small groups, but what the market was finding is when you it expanded that to a lot of people, those systems bogged down. They didn't work very well. And so what we started looking at was what's wrong with that paradigm. And most people are familiar. You send an email out to many people, and so one email is replicated and becomes, let's say it's 10 people. So one email becomes 10 copies of that email sent to 10 people. And then in reply, those 10 people send a response back to you, and it comes back to you. So that's one to many and many to one. What we recognized that when we got into collaboration, we needed to get into a situation where we could have many people exchanging information on many subjects in parallel. And that's where groupware and messaging didn't work very well. In fact, they didn't work at all in large scales. And so we put that team of people together, and metaphorically, I said, we're not coming out of this room until we figure out what's wrong with collaboration. And the other thing that we restricted our programmers from doing was, we're not going to have you start writing code until we figure out what this problem is. And so we took a very skilled team of people, and we said, okay, let's figure this out. 2.5 years into it, at the end of 2000, we had 1999, we had the magic aha moment. We figured out what the problem was. And it surprised all of us how simple the solution was, but it also surprised that none of us had seen it. And we knew that Microsoft and IBM and Novell were not seeing it either, because we had experienced all those systems. In fact, we supported all their systems in the work we had done with the AT&T project. And so that aha moment was when we figured out that the way we think of the way files are stored on our computer is wrong for this kind of many-to-many environment. So when you work on a Word file, let's say, and you store it on your PC, that's a file, it's a bucket of bits, we called it, and that's the way we thought of the way things are stored. It's very much like the old physical files and folders environment. What we recognized that wasn't a way that was going to work in a large-scale internet environment. And so that whole storage model had to change. And so what we recognized as technologists had to change our way of thinking. So we basically cleared the table. We said, okay, we got it. Everything we've been assuming is wrong, and we started again. And that's when the breakthrough occurred. And so once we got the code going and we did a lot of prototyping, we then recognized we had something special. And that's when we started seeking out intellectual property counsel in Washington, D.C. And that's where the story turned really crazy.
That's when it gets nasty. But as we're talking about this, I've so many times, as we've chatted on the phone, I've asked you to explain this to me, and even though I have some experience in this area, the leap that you and your team and Leader Technology took, nobody else could make. Everyone was looking for that. And as you say, they just couldn't see it. It was right there in front of them. But how can you explain to us so that anyone listening to you, in contradistinction to listening to Mark Zuckerberg and his silly ways of explaining what he did, which he has never thoroughly ever explained, even as clearly as you've just explained, how can you help our listeners understand what that step was? Because that's, as you have said, you don't just get a patent because you came up with a new idea you've tacked onto somebody else's. It has to meet certain requirements. And so when you discovered this, What was that like? I mean, was it a new way of thinking for you and your engineers, or?
It was totally new way of thinking. We we essentially had to say, okay, the paradigm of storing a file in a folder is not the way to manage data in the internet. And the other problem you have with storing files in folders is as soon as you fill up your computer hard drive with a bunch of files, what are you going to do? You've got to go replicate that information to another PC. You've got to decide what files you're going to move across, which files are going to stay, and it's a very cumbersome process. And that was the way groupware worked. And so it worked in small teams okay, but it just didn't work in a large scale environment. So what we recognized is we had to change our whole thinking about how to store data when lots of people are working with a piece of information in lots of locations, and we can't predict ahead of time how they might want to use the data. And so the whole storage model had to change, and everybody's familiar with that now as people have worked with social networking. But I liken it to the problem you have with the internet is since you don't know how much volume you're going to have to handle at any given time, you've got to have a storage situation that can ebb and flow with the way people are using information. So what we wanted to do was free people to use the technology without having to worry about where the storage occurred, but not know in advance how they're going to do that. So that was the trick. And so what we developed was an analogy that I think works, is that we had to figure out a way to put the data out there and not care where it's stored, if that makes sense. So in other words, we'll tag the data properly and we'll put it into the system, but let the system decide where to store it. So it's like taking a bunch of cups and hooking them together with little rubber hoses between the cups. And as you pour water into any one cup, it all flows out. So it's the level in all of the hard drives, or in this case the cups, always is the same in all the drives. So as the water starts filling up, you as the technologist who's supporting that environment can easily say, okay, we better get a couple more cups in here, we better get a couple more hard drives on this system because it's starting to fill up. And then as soon as you do that, the level will go back down. And so that's the way internet is storing, the social world is storing data, and that came from this magic aha moment that we had.
And the magic code writing that happened afterwards.
Yeah, how to do that, yes, was a major effort.
How to tag metadata and then send it in all directions and then somehow call it all back when you want. To me, that sounds magical.
We had to invent a new kind of metadata that would tag. So the other big problem with groupware, and people are probably familiar with groupware, but if they're not, when you have a file, and let's say you've got this group of 10 people and one person changes the file somewhere in some city, groupware will then replicate the changed file in everyone's individual environments. And that's very time consuming and resource intensive. So what we said was, let's think about this differently. Let's have the file sitting in one place and never moving. And then let all the people come to the file and edit it and do everything they want. And so we'll keep track of all of that, how people work on that file as a new kind of metadata with ever expanding knowledge base for that metadata. So we developed the idea of context for how people are using the file. And so what is stored related to somebody's profile is the metadata associated with the file, but the file never moves. And by doing that, we increase the capacity and the efficiency of how collaboration works by a factor of probably 10,000. Because now all of a sudden that data is not moving all over the place. With replication, it's moving, it's copying, things are getting out of sync, and then you got this server, the Lotus Notes servers out there trying to keep track of all this movement of this file, and it became a mess in large scale.
My company saw that for 12 years. I worked with one of the guys who helped Steve Jobs really advance the Mac Classic II, and he was a genius, and he actually had the technology that was rolling out of Apple and Microsoft. He's such a genius, they had him testing products, right? 12 years we tested these products from about 2000 or 1999 on. for 12 years, we went on and on and on. We tried all of them. None of them worked.
Right.
None of them worked. We were trying to handle 10,000 students a year. Each one of them had a specific profile that would have hundreds of elements. Every program, we even had programmers come in and we paid huge amounts of money to have them write specific programs for us. Still failed miserably. So we have one of the biggest geniuses who worked for Apple, couldn't work this out for his own company, okay? So I was there, I watched this stuff happen, and it was a miserable failure.
Right.
I couldn't myself comprehend that, but now, look, everyone uses your source code. Everyone, they don't even realize how far this went. When we say social networking, it's not only social networking, it's, and I apologize for using improper terms, but this, what I would imagine called scalability, to go from a small group handling 100 people, right, to handling 1 billion people in one group, simply because their sign-on creates this magical effect of this file that stays in one place, and then you somehow connect all the metadata to it. This was radical. People they knew that if they could do this, that these groups would become worldwide, right? So when you looked at, or can you name all the different, not all, but many of the different programs out there that we use every day, we take full advantage of, and we have no idea that that source code came from you? I know that you said that you can look into Facebook and you can say, here's our source code. So
right,
you know that Facebook got the
essentially anything that's got a login today on the internet starts to infringe our patents.
That's everything. That's every single governmental system, every single commerce system, everything, every bank, everything.
It appears that way. I mean, I haven't seen the actual code, but you can tell by the way it works and the way people interact with it that it's using the patents.
What's that called? It's not called scalability. What is there a technical name for
well,
what you guys came up with?
there's several elements to the way that has to happen. There's a storage element, there's an interface element, and then there's a processing element. So there's kind of 3 layers of the way the code works. But when you log on, the system is able to acknowledge, okay, this is Mike McKibben. And so therefore, as I move around in the system, the metadata associated with somebody else's profile, for example, is able to recognize that this isn't the person who has this profile, this is somebody that's come in from the outside. And so consequently, when I interact with data on somebody else's profile, that particular piece of data is then tagging the information about me to that data. So that element, that metadata element associated with somebody else's profile, is growing and recording this as I move around. And so that was, anybody that does that is using our patent.
Well, my boss, whose name will not be mentioned here, once told me that since my son was so brilliant that he needed to use a program that was a virtual sandbox that allowed him to build from very, very simple elements incredibly complex worlds. And so he said, get into Minecraft. So my son started working in Minecraft, and as I would watch this, it was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen on the internet. And I actually then allowed them to work on the internet because of this virtual sandbox. And that's really my simple understanding, that if we are in Facebook, we're in the sandbox, it's a virtual world, but my version of it, is my version, but then I get to interact with all of your interactions, and then I have to be in a relationship to every other person in that group at the same time. It seems almost impossible that software could have done that. Did it also take hardware that had to advance to the point that when you finally got the software, that the hardware had also advanced so that it could actually do this?
Yeah, as memory got cheaper, the idea of having to manage the amount of data that you had associated with anybody's profile became a non-issue, because right now, as far as I can tell from all the press, the NSA is storing everything. So they don't even care about dumping it now. It's too expensive to even call through the data and dump it. They just keep it all. Yes. And that's why these data centers are growing to be massive.
It is shocking. In the early days, in the 70s, when I worked with memory.
Yeah, well, memory was still an issue when we were designing. And I think that kept our design very efficient, because we looked at that issue. In fact, when we were kind of looking at how we were going to go to market, we were looking at, well, how much are we going to charge for this? Because memory was still an issue. Mm-hmm. But between 2000 and 2000 now, that's become a non-issue. So yeah, hardware is an issue. With scalability, you've got to be able to have servers basically chained up that can keep ahead of the requirements of the user. At the old days, the idea was you manage your network by deciding what your load is going to be, and you kind of make all these assumptions, and you know it up front because you know I'm going to have 10 users that are going to come on and they're going to do this or that or the other with the database and the application. And that was the way you tended to design the size of a network. But our whole problem set was different because we're saying, A, we don't know how many users are going to use it on the internet. We don't know what kind of data they may want to use in their profiles in advance. And then as the users use it, the whole idea was the system adapts to the user's requirements rather than the user having to require or adapt to the system requirements. That was a paradigm shift.
And then that's what is the foundation of the fact that your source code could then be used in Facebook, in Gmail, in YouTube, in Twitter, in Instagram, in Snapchat, in all these different systems. All is based upon your code because you wouldn't be able to get in, create the network, create the virtual sandbox, have all the interaction, have the metadata being tagged properly. And then, as you say, define it specifically for the need, as we've seen
Right.
it, whether it was PayPal or no matter what it
Right,
was.
that was the old paradigm, design it to the need. So you have an accounting piece of software, you have a word processor, you have applications that do certain things. In our case, our application was human collaboration. And you can't predict how human beings want to collaborate in advance if your system is in fact doing its job. What we added to that was issues of two key priorities that have been ignored since the theft. One is respect for the person's privacy, and another one is a respect for their property. Property and privacy were two key issues, constitutional issues, that we designed into the system. So when you made a comment earlier about, well, I go into somebody's environment and I can see everything, that wasn't the plan. That wasn't the plan, that everything you have is going to be open, so that you're running naked through the public square all the time with all your data. That didn't make sense from a privacy standpoint. So we had basically a privacy slider scale in the system so that you, as the host of a group of people, could decide how open or private you wanted your collaboration to be. And you could actually define that down to the individual data element level. That was all just ignored. I use the analogy, we had a slider bar from 0 to 10. What the thieves did was slide all that to 0 and just ignore the idea of privacy.
That's when the info war really became pitched, because they wanted to surveil everyone, and you wanted to give people privacy, but access to basically all knowledge, as we can pick up our phone and do a Google search and we can find out anything we want. So you wanted to provide that possibility for freedom of information and for information to be able to be structured by the choices of the individual, instead of, oh, we're going to give you all these choices as Facebook or Google does or these other systems, but then we're going to make sure to surveil it all. Now, I don't believe that when you started, you had any idea that your invention could be used to be weaponized as a PSYOPs tool, as we now find out. Facebook admits yesterday, Sean Parker admitted that they created it, and when they say they, he also mentions the other kind of people who took your source code. He mentioned, of course, the guy, who was the man he mentioned?
He mentioned Instagram.
Instagram, which was years later. So what he was saying there is, we didn't invent this. If you listen to his words, he stumbles around and says, oh, Mark, oh my, oh that, we wrote, oh no, they wrote, oh no, we took it, oh no, the invention, and then invention, then he backs off, oh, it wasn't an invention, because then there'd be a patent, and then they'd have to admit the theft, because they say it's open source. They say,
these guys have gotten extremely skilled at equivocation.
Absolutely, and that's their only job, because their job isn't to write code. I don't know that any of these guys can write code. I don't know that Mark Zuckerberg has ever written a line of code. We know that we're going to go into that in other conversations, where everyone he worked with at Harvard has basically sued him, and he's paid off most of those people. There's still active suits we'll talk about with you later. But when you, at even being the cutting edge of technology with what you were doing with ATT and emails and all the groupware and the legacy groupware. Did you have any idea when you and your team discovered this, how big this would be and how it would actually change everything in our modern world?
We did. We did. We knew we were onto something special. When we had that aha moment, we knew this was going to be big. And that was my objective. I wanted to solve an engineering problem. And in solving the engineering problem, what we recognized, and we applied some very high design approaches to how this was designed. I actually constructed a very special design approach that would put a lot of smart people in a room, and then we would do some very different things than the way product is normally designed. Normally products are designed by saying, okay, I want to build that chair and I already know it's going to have 2 arms on it and a back on it and a seat on it, and so, oh, that's a great chair. And that's the way most products are designed. What I recognized as a designer was that we didn't know what this is supposed to look like because the entire market is going off in this direction. And we don't know that that's necessarily the way to go. So we said, let's not preconceive a solution, because all we're going to do as programmers, we're just going to program more stuff. And it's probably going to fit right into, and a lot of the tools were also geared toward going down this direction. So I designed a program, or a design approach that combined the best of a lot of different design approaches from Germany, from the US, and others. And we attacked the problem from the standpoint of, we don't know what this product is supposed to look like, but we all have experience of what it shouldn't look like. So
that's very funny.
We actually did this in storyboards. We actually said, what isn't it supposed to be? And so we had to fill the whole board with things it's not going to be. And we did that for probably 2 years. We kept saying, that's not it, that's not it, that's not it. But the interesting thing, if you look at it in terms of a storyboard, as we put that up on the board, what started taking shape was this empty spot that became social networking. It emerged. It told us what it wanted to be, and that was exciting.
Did it tell you it needed to be scalable to about infinity? Because that's
Well,
what
we
you've
knew
done.
that. That's what we were designing for. We knew, well, the internet's huge, so we've got to be able to stay up with it. I think this is why the military-industrial complex wanted to steal it so badly. Although at the time, I was just a naive young entrepreneur who knew he had a good idea and was looking for the best advice he could get. What we ended up walking into was the buzzsaw, the deep state shadow government. That was a surprise. And that's taken a decade to
and some of these things you've only realized within the last few months.
Exactly.
The fraud, the deception, the stacked court systems, the subterfuge, how far it went,
Right.
who was behind it, the
we
secret
had
groups that
no
were behind
idea
it.
of any of that.
So really, with all of the best intentions in the world, you thought you were trying to help humanity, and now you've gotten into a case where a 17-year-long lawsuit, $10 million in legal fees, $20 million in investments, 760,000 lines of code you had to write.
Once we started getting abused by the system, the engineer in me kicked in, and I said, this isn't right. Let's go figure out what the problem is. I didn't know how deep the rabbit hole was. What I did know is certain things were going wrong, and they are not supposed to go wrong in a constitutional government. And that investigation has taken from 2012 until now to figure out.
You know, Betsy and I came across a site that your supporters create called the Americans for Innovation site. 530 pages of indictable information on the crooks who stole your invention. It's the most amazing site I've ever seen. And when you read it, you see the very criminals in our own time being their historical patterns. You can see their modus operandi. You can see the way they work. You can see the laws that were created. You can see the patent laws that were manipulated. You can see all of this by reading what you and your shareholders and your supporters have put out. And it is one of the most amazing things. So make sure that you go to Americans for Innovation, because what you will find there, if you will be overwhelmed with the fact that Michael and Leader Technology kept records on every single speck of this. There is nothing that they have not done. They have done so much legal work that nobody else that I know has actually sat in the room and done depositions on this evil cabal, and particularly this is the tech evil cabal. And I call it evil, and I don't say evil lightly. Many, many people have suffered because of this. So I recommend that, because many of the details, we can only give a general overview in these conversations, but if you want the details down to the letters of agreement, everything, the copyrights that were stolen, the projects that were proof of, proof of that they can work. You had to, again and again.
Proof of concept.
Proof of concept. Again, you had to prove it again and again to these people. Why? Because they were stealing it as they went along.
Right.
So
it was, as we now know, some of this information only recently, it was being stolen off of our engineering, I'm using a metaphor, off of our engineering design boards before the ink was even dry.
It's one of the most incredible stories, because when you look at the damages, you're talking trillions of dollars. You're talking a whole host of fake tech lords that practically lived at the White House for the 8 years at the Obama administration. So I have one last question. Because you're an engineer, you solve things, you fix things. So you got a bad situation here, but you also have at least 3 versions that I've heard of win-win scenarios. Can you give us at least, so we can end on a note of hope, that you aren't, just continually being put into despair by forces that are really incredibly powerful. So we're going to talk about what keeps you going, but really, what are some of these win-win scenarios you've created?
Well, I have a group of very bright shareholders. And so we got together recently and we said, what are we going to do here? Because this is a rat's nest. This is the biggest rat's nest ever. And we can't be chasing around all these companies in lawsuits for the rest of our lives. One of the things we've learned is that the legal system itself is a playground for these corrupt people. And so how do we find a win-win situation? And so to cut it's not a very complicated story short, we have developed an approach. Basically, social networking has never been had fees associated with it. So essentially, the entire government and the entire tech community has had 17 years of free use of our technology. And every app you see on a phone is using our technology. So what if I took your phone today? The average person uses 30 apps a day. That's a recent statistic. So let's say I take your phone out and I cut all those apps off and hand it back to you. So all you can do is make a phone call. Now, would you like that?
I think that means war in America.
Okay. So if I then say to you, did you realize that the group that invented all those apps has never been paid a dime for all those things you enjoy? Would you pay $2, $3, $4, $5 a month to pay this person back or this group back for all this benefit that you receive? Would you be willing to do that?
We'd pay whatever it took, Michael.
$3, $4, $5. That's
no,
all
we
it's
pay a
gonna
lot
take.
more.
Okay, but let's just use small numbers. So what we've found is most people are reasonable. They don't know about this story. They don't know about the theft. They don't know that they're participating in the theft. So of course they would. That's the average decent American, decent person, citizen of the world, actually. So what we've said is, okay, hey government, start paying us $2 a month per user for the 17 years of free use in the past and going forward. We will sign a license so that everyone becomes legal with their use of their social media. And then government, you can charge $2, $3, $4, $5, $6 a month on top of that and generate new revenue. We figured out what that would be for the US government. That would be anywhere between $200 and $500, $600, $700 billion a year in new revenue without increasing taxes.
Instead of going to the tech lords.
Instead of going to the tech lords. The tech lords would have to pay up They're the ones that provided all this service to the government, so therefore their bonding companies can pay this back, so they're not even going to be on any money. It's going to be their bonding companies. So everybody wins.
That's a win-win-win.
Exactly. And we don't go down this route of continually chasing people around in this rat's nest called our legal system.
And you can circumvent even a lawsuit by a couple of your plans.
Right. Well, this system was created, as we've learned in our research, by a series of executive orders, the Patriot Act, a number of things like that have been developing ever since the early 90s. And the authority to run this system has been focused like a laser on the president. So the president has the power to write a check to us and to authorize this to go into effect.
So Donald can trump the tech lord.
He could. All the authorities are there.
Well, as Obama basically did the opposite with his lawlessness. Michael?
It started before President Obama, but yes.
I'm getting an image in my mind, and it says, inventor of Facebook. And then we can say leader technology. $20 million investment, hundreds of shareholders, teams of geniuses working 3 years to create 760,000 lines of code. Or we could believe Mark Zuckerberg, one man, $0 invested, 1 week of work during finals, no shareholders. You can decide yourself. That's what I get. As we talk to you, it is so obvious that you're sincere and that everything that you've done also has been very carefully kept track of, so that in your lawsuits and in going to court and in appeal court, your case went all the way to the Supreme Court and was knocked down. But now it can be reopened again through all kinds of new things that have come to light, new evidence that has come to light. So we're not talking about something that happened in the past that we're crying about. We're talking about something that has to be acknowledged now and is being acknowledged now because of Facebook's corruption that is coming out into the news. But also with your win-win-win plan, this is something that could be fantastic for everyone, including the users, the end users, including your company, and that, as you say, even the people who stole this willingly, knowingly, they would actually be covered by their own insurance.
Right.
This is an amazing plan. Michael, your story is incredible. We're going to continue with these conversations, and we can't thank you enough for framing this for us today so that we can get a perspective to see where you have come from, and in the future conversations we're going to see where it is that you're going and who it was that you were working with and all the different areas around it. So again, we're so thrilled that we got a chance to come down and that you agreed to meet with us, and we thank you and your shareholders and those geniuses you worked with.
By the way, I didn't welcome you to Columbus. Welcome to Columbus.
Well, it's a beautiful place.
From the state up north.
Yes, from where we are at. We are just so thrilled that you willingly had us come down and meet with you in the Leader Technology Group. So thank you so much for the conversation.
You're welcome.